Hello and welcome to this short series on how to draw battle maps with Tom Kartos. That's me. Hi. The aim of this series is going to be to show you that you don't need to be an incredibly talented, gifted artist to make some really good looking battle maps for your game. Instead, we're going to be relying on a bunch of shortcuts and tricks that you can do in Photoshop that will give us a really good looking end result. Now, as I say, we are going to be working in Photoshop, but everything I'm going to be covering here can also be done in free image editing software such as GIMP. Before we get started, we need to do a little bit of setup and also go over some Photoshop basics. This isn't going to be a Photoshop beginner's tutorial, but I will go over a lot of the tools that we're going to be relying on to make sure that if you are a beginner, you should be able to follow along without too much difficulty. Having said that, if this is your first time using Photoshop or GIMP or whatever other image editing software you've chosen to use, make sure you familiarize yourself with the UI at least a little bit in advance, and it will help out a lot. I'll also include a download link for the finished PSD for the map we're going to be working on in the description below so you can have it for reference. So the first thing we're going to do is set up our canvas. You can see I've already got a canvas set up here, but I'll show you how I go about setting that up when I'm creating a new file. So you can see when you open new document in Photoshop, it will give you these options over on the right for the resolution you want and the width and the height of the canvas. I generally prefer to work in inches because that is what our battle map scale is going to be set to. And I like to work in 300 pixels per inch because that's going to give us a really nice high resolution if we want to get a professional quality print done, but it's not going to be too high that it will run your machine into the ground. If you're going to be printing at home or setting up a battle map for VTT or online play, then probably around 140 to 150 would be plenty, but it's really personal preference. In terms of the size of the map, again, that's going to be down to what your computer can handle and your own personal preference. I like to work in multiples of 8.5 by 11 inches. So if you are printing at home, then you can tile up the map file and turn it into separate pieces to stick together. But you can equally just go for whatever you need and whatever your computer can manage. So I'm going to be working on a 22 by 17 inch map today. I find that tends to be large enough for an encounter, but not so big that it's going to bog down my machine. The next thing we're going to do is set up a grid in the background of our canvas that we can snap to as we're drawing. This will make sure that as we go, we are aligning everything to the grid. That's going to make it easier to play on and also easier to set up in your VTT software. So to do that, we're going to go up to Photoshop, Preferences, down to Guides, Grids, and Slices. I'm working on a Mac, but if you're working on Windows, it's pretty much exactly the same. You just need to find the Preferences options. Now in Guides, Grids, and Slices, you'll see here, there is a section for grid. We're going to set it to one grid line every inch with 4 subdivisions. I personally find it easier to split it into halves and quarters when I'm drawing, but if you prefer, you could split it in 5 subdivisions if you're working, say, with 5E, where every inch is 5 feet, so every subdivision would be 1 foot. Again, that's personal preference, it's up to you, but this is how I like to work. You can also set the color of the grid and the line type if you want. Once we have that set up, then you can just hit Command or Control and apostrophe, and it will toggle the grid on and off. That's going to be really useful as we're going forwards. The last thing I'm going to talk about in terms of setup is folder and layer management. I know a lot of artists don't really focus on that. They're quite happy to have a whole bunch of unnamed layers, or they just work on one layer and merge everything down. But I like to work in a non-destructive workflow, which essentially means that if I get further into the project and want to go back and make some edits, that's very easy for me to do. But in order to do that, everything needs to be carefully named and organized so I can easily find it. Sometimes I'll come back to a map a year later to make edits for an adventure that's being written, and making sure that I have everything organized in this way is really helpful for me. So you can see on the right here, I've got a bunch of folders already set up, and we'll be going through each of these in future videos. And I'll talk about them in more detail then, but I'm just going to mention it now so you know that I will be naming every layer and folder. You don't have to, but I recommend it. So before we get started on actually making the battle map, I'm going to go over some of the tools that we're going to be using in Photoshop. The first two are quite similar in what they can achieve, but also subtly different in the way that we use them. And we're going to be relying on them both heavily throughout. So I'll go over both in detail now and also show you some examples of how they work. So first up is the layer mask. The layer mask is a tool that allows us to edit in a non-destructive manner. What this means is we can effectively hide parts of the layer as though we were erasing them, but it also gives us the option to unhide them in the future if we decide we want to bring bits back or edit the design in some way. So in order to help explain the layer mask, I'm going to show you a quick example of how it works. You can see I have this wood grain texture set up on the canvas. We will talk more about textures later on, but for now, it's here. And you can see over on the right-hand side in my layers panel, I have the layer selected. You can see that because there's the little white square around it. With the layer selected, I'm going to go down to the bottom right of my layers panel, and there's this icon here that looks like a rectangle with a circle cut out of it. I'm going to click that, and that is going to apply the layer mask to my layer, which at the moment looks like this little white box. And you can see that the layer mask itself is now selected because it has the white square around it. This is something you need to make sure you keep track of when you're editing. If you select the layer, you're going to be editing the layer. If you select the layer mask, you're going to be editing the layer mask. That might seem like a slightly confusing separation of terms, but it will make sense as we go forwards. So once you have the layer mask selected, you can edit it by using a paintbrush or fill or any other tool you like, and using either black or white or any intermediate shade of grey. Now, painting on the layer mask with black will hide the layer. Painting on it with grey will hide it to different extents depending on how dark or light the grey is. And then painting on it with white will bring back the original layer underneath. You can also see now that the layer mask icon shows where I've painted that black, grey and white, and you can also show it on screen by holding Alt or Option and clicking on the layer mask, and that will show you how you've edited the layer mask itself. Then again, holding Alt and Option and clicking it will take that away. We can also use a selection to create a layer mask. So if I delete this layer mask by right-clicking on it and going delete layer mask, I can now use the grid that we set up initially, choose a rectangle in the center of the canvas, turn the grid back off. And with that selection made and that layer selected, I'll click the layer mask icon again, and it will now make a layer mask for us of that selection. And that covers pretty much everything you need to know about the basics of layer masks. So the next thing to look at is the clipping mask. Now, the clipping mask is a layer or a group of layers that act as though a layer mask is applied to all of them. But in this case, the layer mask is defined by the bottom layer in the group. Again, that probably sounds pretty confusing, so we'll go over an example demonstration to show you how it works. So you can see I still have my wood grain layer with the layer mask applied on the canvas. And we are going to use this as our base for the clipping masks. So to set up a clipping mask, we're going to create a new layer on top of this wood grain layer. Here it's just called layer 1, and you can see it's above the layer in my layer palette. That's important. Then hovering between, on this line between the two, we're going to hold Alt or Option, and you'll see I get this little square with an arrow next to it. This icon will only appear when I'm between the two, and then I'm going to click. And now layer 1 is applied to this pattern fill as a clipping mask. Now what that means is anything that we draw on layer 1 will only be visible if it is on top of our pattern fill. So you can see I can draw outside the lines, but it's still kept within that area. If I hold Alt or Option and click again to disable this clipping mask, you can see it goes outside the lines. And then reapply it, it stays exactly where I want it to be. This can be really useful, say if we've set up a texture and you want to apply some definition to it or some patterns and you don't want to have to work too hard to constrain yourself within that area. Alternatively, you could just apply the same layer mask to every layer, but we may end up with a number of clipping masks on this one layer. And this not only keeps the Photoshop file smaller, but also keeps your layers grouped together and easier to manage. The next thing we're going to look at is layer modes. So you can see over in my layers panel, if I select my clipping mask layer, I can go up to the top here and there's a drop down menu that currently says normal. If I select the arrow, it will show me a whole bunch of options here. They all do different things, but the ones we're going to focus on are multiply, screen, and overlay. You're welcome to play around with the others, but those are the ones we're going to be using 90% of the time as we go forwards. And what these do is they cause your layers to interact with one another differently. So currently, as we're set on normal, if I were to select another color and paint on top, you will just see that color. But if I go up here and change this layer mode to multiply, it will cause whatever's on layer 1 to darken what's on our pattern fill layer underneath. This can be useful for adding shadows or just creating areas of definition. Then we can also go the same one and change it to screen, and it will effectively do the opposite. It will make everything lighter underneath. And then finally, if I have some light and some dark colors, and we switch this to overlay, it does a combination of the two. The lighter areas will be lighter, and the darker areas will be darker. Now, the one thing you have to be careful of, as you can see, it also adds a bit of color in. So if I go for a pure dark gray, it will just darken the color underneath. But if I go, let's say, dark green, it will darken it and add some of that green color. So this can be really useful depending on what you want to do, but you just need to be aware that with multiply, screen, and overlay, it will not only darken and lighten, but it will also add color. So the last Photoshop tool we're going to look at that we're going to be relying on quite a lot is layer effects. So with my pattern fill layer here selected, with the layer mask still applied, we're going to go again down to the bottom right hand corner of the layer palette. See this little FX icon? We're going to click on that. There's a bunch of options in here and all of them are quite useful, but the two that we're going to be focusing on are stroke and bevel and emboss. Now stroke allows you to add an outline to whatever's selected in the layer. And I use this a lot for floors, for walls, for windows, basically everything. I like to add an outline. You may choose to not do that. There's plenty of other map makers who do similar sort of style maps to me who don't outline stuff and go for a more photoreal look. But this is how I prefer to work things. And you can see up here in our layer style options box, we have a size option, so you can make the outline as big or as small as you like. If you're trying to match what I do an 8 pixel line for the main walls. I do a 6 pixel line for lower walls or window sills or fences or things like that. And I do a 4 pixel line for floor textures. And just having that slight difference in line thickness helps differentiate depth in your map. You can also, if you want, change the color of the outline. And here where it says blend mode, you have all the same options we looked at before in the layer modes. So you can set it to multiply, screen, color dodge, whatever you like. Now the other style that we're going to be looking at is the bevel emboss, which is just above stroke here. And if we go into that and have a look at our options, you can see up here, we have the style, inner bevel, outer bevel, emboss. I tend to use inner bevel, but you can play around with the others if you want. And what this is going to do is just add an edge. So if I just increase the size here, it will become obvious. You can see on our layer, it's adding what is called a bevel around the texture. So if you want to add a little bit of kind of a 3D effect to your objects or your architectural elements in the map, this is a really quick and easy way to do it. We have some other options here. So as well as the size, you can change the depth, which will change the intensity. You have soften. So if you want slightly rounder edges, if you want completely round edges, we can change from chisel hard to smooth. or chisel soft for something in between. You can also change the angle of your lighting. So this is the angle that the sun or the light is coming from. So say we want it from the bottom left corner, we go from -125, and this lower one is the height of the angle of your light source. So the lower that is, the less intense it will be. 45 degrees is going to give you around about your best option. And then we can also set the highlight mode and the shadow mode. So I like to use screen and multiply, which we discussed before, but you could play around with those if you want different effects. And you can set the opacity of those as well. So you have a lot of minute control over this. But if you just want to go for a simple setup, I would go for inner bevel, chisel hard or smooth, depending on what you need. Depth of between 150 and 200. Size is going to depend on your object. You want your direction to be up because otherwise it will flip the shadow direction. Set your angle. And then I tend to have screen and multiply set to 50 and 50. And then we have a nice effect. I'll set my stroke back to black. And now we have a nice little 3D looking object to go in our battle map. In order to help us create some nice straight lines with clean edges, we're going to set up a new brush in Photoshop. I know, especially if you're a beginner, creating a brush might sound really complex, but actually this is going to be as basic as it can be. So what we're going to do is create a square brush. So to do that, we're going to go to File, New, set up a new canvas. We're going to make sure that the resolution is set to whatever you chose initially, not 3000, 300. And for pixels, it doesn't really matter, but I'm going to go for one that is ½ inch size. So this will be 150 pixels by 150 pixels. Or if you're on inches, you just set it to ½ an inch by ½ an inch. And we're going to set that up as a new canvas. I'm going to create a new layer and switch off the background layer. And then all I'm going to do is just fill this new layer with black. We now have a black square. Then to turn this into a brush, I'm going to go up to Edit, Define Brush Preset, and it's going to let us name that. The name isn't too important right now because we're going to change it in a second. Then we're going to go back to our original canvas layer. I'll just set up a new layer to draw on so we can test it. I'm going to go into my brushes. And you'll see down here, we have this new brush set up. I'm going to make sure I've got it selected. And I'm going to open up my brush properties palette. If you don't have that already, you can go into Window and go to Brush Settings. And in the brush tip shape, we're going to set the spacing to 1%. Then we're going to click on this little add icon, and that's actually going to make a new brush, starting with the old brush, but with the settings we've updated. You can see there's a whole bunch of other brush options here. We're not going to worry about them for now. We might talk about them a bit more later on, but at the moment, we're just doing something really simple and basic. So I'll click the plus icon, call this square brush. It would help if I could type. Nope, still failing. Square brush, it's called Square Brush TC, just to differentiate it from my other brush. So now I've got that selected, Square Brush TC. Now that comes in at the size we set it up as, so I created it at a 150 pixel. But you can change the size of your brush up here, or you can use the keyboard shortcut, which is the square brackets, to go smaller or larger. Now that we have that brush, we can bring back up our original grid, and we're going to use it to help us set up our sketch. But that's in the next video. We'll talk about that later on. So if you did want to look at making brushes of other shapes, we can also do that. I'll very quickly go over how we do that. So I'll create a new canvas again. Make sure we're going same resolution. This time I'll go for a 300 by 300 pixel canvas, or 1 inch by 1 inch. Turning off the background layer and setting up a new layer again. And this time I'm going to use the shape tool, which is this little icon over here. You can see you can get a rectangle, rounded rectangle, ellipse, polygon. I'm going to set up a polygon. So you can see up at the top here, I've got the sides set to 6. You could change that to whatever you want, but for now, we'll make a hexagon. And I want to find about the middle of the canvas, but it doesn't really matter because it's only going to select whichever part that you've chosen, not the background. So you can see that's created this new polygon. Now up here, you can see the stroke is set to black. I'm going to turn off the stroke and set a fill to black. So we only have the inside of the shape set up filled with black. I also want that so that the top and bottom edges are horizontal. So I'll just rotate that. Rotate, you can set up by hitting Command or Control T to bring up the transform box, and then just going up to the corner where the little arrow goes into a corner arrow and spinning. And then that's all we need to do. We can set that up by going Edit, Define Brush Preset. We'll call this one Hexagon 01. We'll do the same as before. We'll select our hexagon brush. We'll go into brush settings and set the spacing to 1%. Add. We'll call it hexagon TC. Now we have our hexagon brush, and we can do exactly the same things we did. So maybe we'll use this for creating some more interesting shaped pillars, or maybe you want to have beveled corners on your walls. You have lots of options. So the last thing we're going to look at in this video is how to create a basic seamless pattern texture. We'll be relying on textures a lot as we go forwards. I use a lot from a third-party website called textures.com, which has commercial licensing options for their seamless textures and also allows free downloads each day if that's something you're looking for. I also do make quite a few of my own textures, and we will talk more in detail about how to make those later on. But for now, to give you a demonstration of the basics of the process, we're going to make a grid overlay for the battle map. So the process for making this grid texture starts out quite similar to how we made the brush preset. We are going to set up a new canvas. Again, we're going to make sure it's at 300 pixels per inch or whatever resolution you're working at. We're going to set it to 300 by 300 or 1 inch by 1 inch and create that new canvas. We'll create a new layer, turn off the background layer again because we want it to be a transparent texture. So we don't want the white of the background showing through. I'm then going to grab the square brush we just made, and I'm going to set it to 4 pixels. And then I'm going to turn on the grid that we set up. Again, holding down Command or Control apostrophe, we'll toggle that on and off. You can't quite see it at the moment, but if I switch the background layer back on for now, you can see that it's there. I'll turn that off again. Then I'm going to go onto my layer, and with the black selected, I am going to hold down Shift, which will allow us to draw a straight line, and draw a line along the bottom and a line along the right-hand side. Because we had the grid on, that will snap perfectly. So the line will go exactly down the grid. If I turn off the grid, you can just see on the right-hand side and on the bottom, there's that black line. Now I'm going to set that up by going to Edit, Define Pattern this time, not Define Brush Preset. I'm going to call it TC Grid. And then if I go back to my canvas, I'm going to go in the layers palette down to this little half-filled circle icon, click on there and go to Pattern. And this is going to bring up all the patterns I have. You can see I've got quite a collection, and we will have a look at how I set those up in the future. But I'm going to go to the one we just created, which is TC Grid. And you can see what it does is it takes that initial 1 inch pattern that we created and it just replicates it across the entire canvas. And because we turned off the background layer and made it a transparent texture, if I have my grid layer above my textures, you'll see that the textures actually show through from below. And if you want, you could set that grid opacity a bit lower so it's not quite so in your face. Now, obviously, if you're going to be using these on VTT, you might not need the grid, so you can turn it off, but it's useful to have it there as a reference as we draw anyway. And that pretty much wraps everything up for what we're going to cover in this video. The next video will be covering the sketch phase of the design. That's the end of this video. Thanks so much for watching. If you found it useful or enjoyed it, please give it a like or maybe share it with a friend. If you have any ideas for future videos I could make or anything you'd like to see me do, please leave it in the comments below. If you want to skip making the maps yourself and get instant access to literally hundreds of pre-made maps, check out my Patreon. We also have map assets, creature and character tokens, 5e adventures, Foundry VTC ready modules, and tons more, including plenty of free content. Go over to patreon.com/tomcartos to check out what we have. I also stream my map making for patrons in my Discord server, so feel free to drop in, ask me some questions, watch me work, and just hang out. All the links are in the description below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.